All right, good morning to everybody. It's time for us to begin. If you will, turn your Bibles to the book of Acts, chapter 24. That's where we will begin this morning. We are definitely towards the end of this good book. For the rest of the time, basically, Paul is going to be in custody. Even as he travels to different areas, he's still pretty much going to be under house arrest, if you will, basically. Last week, we kind of saw the beginnings of that. He had provided his defense in front of some of the Jews in the Sanhedrin. He described his conversion, and of course, they didn't like that, and the Romans were ready to beat him, and of course, he appealed to his citizenship. And the next day he went before the Sanhedrin again, and that's when he mentioned the resurrection. And of course, that crowd, that lit a fire to them, and it ended up becoming a big argument to them. And of course, that led to 40 of the Jews coming together and making a vow to not eat or sleep or drink or anything like that until they could kill Paul. I wonder if they all starved to death. I don't know. But they made that vow, and of course, Paul's nephew heard about it. Paul instructed him to go to Lysias, the commander, and tell him about it. And so that's how he ended up being taken to Caesarea. And that's where we're at now. That's where Paul is. And so let's pick up reading in chapter 24 of Acts, verse 1. And after 5 days, after 5 days of what? Well, it could be after 5 days he had been in Caesarea, or it could have been after 5 days after leaving Jerusalem. We're not really sure, but after 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus. Now, let's not get confused with the Ananias here. This is obviously not the Ananias that helped convert Paul, and don't get confused with another person that was in the same position in the time of Jesus named Annas. This is obviously somebody different, but his name is Ananias, and he held the position of a high priest. Historical records tell us that he was not a very good guy. He was one of the most evil people to hold this position, and so he would not be a good guy. Obviously, he had evil feelings towards the apostle, and so some of the elders, that would be leading men of the Sanhedrin, came with him, and they brought a spokesman, one man named Tertullus. Some translations describe him as a lawyer. A good way to think about his occupation is he was an orator. He was a good speaker. He was trained in rhetoric, and so he could form an argument very good. And as we'll see in just a moment, he was capable of flattering his audience and things along that nature. And so this is the person that they brought with them, basically to represent their side of the story. Continuing on in verse 1, they laid before the governor their case against Paul, and when he had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him. So that word for accuse, I just want to point out, is a word that suggests a formal charge in a legal forum. And so this is just another little detail that Luke provides for us that kind of highlights his accuracy in his recording. As we've been through this book, I haven't really mentioned it very much, but Luke has always been accurate with things along this nature. He used the correct wording to describe people, places, directions that they were going. He always says that we're going up to Jerusalem. Why is that? Well, Jerusalem's always higher in elevation. When you're leaving Jerusalem, you're always going down to wherever you're going. Luke was always accurate with these things. He was always accurate with nautical terms. As they traveled on the sea, he would use the accurate wording. And so this is, again, just another slight example of Luke and his attention to detail and his historical accuracy. All right, continuing on with Tertullus's argument, starting at the end of verse 2. Now he's talking to Felix, the governor at the time. Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation. In every way and everywhere, we accept this with all gratitude. So, as I mentioned just a moment ago, Tertullus would be described as an orator, someone who is very good at public speaking, basically. Basically, what he is doing is he is just buttering up the governor Felix. Pretty much everything that he just said, starting out with his defense in addressing Felix, had about an ounce of truth and a whole lot of exaggeration. Okay? It is true that Felix had done some things to squash some rioting. He had done that. And so when he says that it is through you we enjoy much peace, there is some truth in that. However, residents in this area would have said that peace overall would have been enjoyed really more in spite of Felix rather than because of Felix. Felix was not appreciated or respected or even liked very much by the Jews at all. As a matter of fact, Felix lost his position, as we'll see at the end of chapter 24. It doesn't give us this detail, but the Jews had basically reported Felix as being inept at his job to Nero, Caesar. And so Caesar replaced him with Festus. And so really, Tertullus is laying it on thick here, basically. He's buttering him up because he wants him to be on their side. And so he says that they are enjoying much peace. Well, no, not really. And he also gives him credit for having foresight. Another word for that foresight would be providence. It's almost as if he's describing him as God, right? And so that's how Tertullus is addressing him. I do find it interesting that he describes Felix as most excellent Felix. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Who else has been described as most excellent? Who? Yes, Theophilus. Who did Luke write his first account to? Most excellent Theophilus. And so that gives us somewhat of an idea of possibly the position that Theophilus held in the Roman government. That is a title for a Roman official, most excellent. And so I find that interesting. Verse 3 is a huge exaggeration. In every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. Tertullus is saying, we Jews, we accept your administration with all thankfulness, and we receive it happily. Well, no, that is very, very inaccurate. That was a huge exaggeration. And so again, he's really trying to butter him up. Look at verse 4, but to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. One writer said, if there's any redeeming quality of Tertullus' speech, it was that it was going to be brief. That was it. And I tend to agree with him. Verse 5, for we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Okay, so he's finally getting down to the point of bringing the official charges against Paul to Felix. And he really gives 4 different things against Paul. Number 1, he describes him as a plague. Number 2, he says that he stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world. And then number 3, he is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And then at the beginning of verse 6, he says he tried to profane the temple. So I find these descriptions somewhat interesting for us to think about. First off, he describes him as a plague. The word is meant to describe a deadly infectious disease. Now, Tertullus meant this as a derogatory term, obviously, to describe Paul. However, I think if we take a step back and we think about maybe some of the characteristics of this type of plague, we can see that maybe he was almost inadvertently giving Paul somewhat of a compliment. Unfortunately, all of us in here are a little too familiar with this type of disease, right? What are some of the characteristics that you think of when you think about a plague or an infectious disease, right? Well, you think about what we've all been through the last several years. It's not hard for us to imagine. One, there's really very little you could stop it, right? None of us were going to stop COVID, right? There was very little you could do to stop it. Number two, if you think about it, anytime you encounter something like this, it really starts from inside and it works its way out, right? It manifests itself outward from inside, right? And so some of these things you think about, and you think about the effects of Paul's works, they are somewhat similar. Can you stop the gospel? You cannot stop the effects of the gospel, can you? How does the gospel work? From the inside out, doesn't it? The gospel is meant to pierce the heart, and then it starts reflecting itself on the outside, right? And so there are some things that I think, of course, Tertullus did not mean it this way whatsoever. But I think if you take a step back, he's inadvertently giving him a compliment. Further, notice what he says. He's one who stirs up riots among all the Jews and throughout the world. Again, this is an inadvertent compliment. How many people had Paul been able to reach? Well, Tertullus says at least all the Jews, right? Throughout where? The whole world. Again, appreciate the effect of the gospel. I think, unfortunately, we have in our mind that we can't fix the world. Well, we can't, but the gospel can. And so really the only way that we're going to change people is to what? Is to tell them the gospel. And we see Paul was able to reach a great many people by his life by just talking about the gospel over and over and over. And we have the same opportunity before us. We just need to take advantage of it. Then Tertullus describes him as the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarene. This term sect is the same word that we get our word for heresy. It was meant to signify a division and these type things. It was really he was suggesting when he said this, that Christianity is an illegal religion. And so, of course, this would not be an accurate description whatsoever. Now, I do find it interesting that he describes it as the sect of the Nazarenes. Some people will attach to this verse the authority to be able to identify yourself as a disciple of the Nazarene and things along that nature. Nowhere in this verse do we have the authority to be identified as a Nazarene. This is the only place in the New Testament that a Christian is given that title, a Nazarene, and it is given by an enemy in derision. You remember back in one of the gospel accounts early on in the life of Jesus, somebody made the comment that what? Nothing good can come from Nazareth, right? And so clearly Tertullus meant this as a derogatory comment. This was not something that was meant to be good. And so I think it's important for us to know that just because this man identified Paul as a Nazarene does not give us authority for us to identify ourselves as Nazarenes, as some people try to do. All right, verse 6, he even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. Does anybody have the Old King James translation? No? So in the Old King James, you have the end of verse 6, you have all of verse 7, and then you have the beginning of verse 8 within the text. It's probably in brackets, is it not? Yeah? And so most modern translations have a footnote, right? Mine has a footnote that says, and we would have judged him according to our law, but the chief captain Lysias came and with great violence took him out of our hands, commanding his accusers to come before you, and then it picks up in the text with verse 8. The reason that that's a footnote is in the earliest manuscripts that we have, that information is not there. And so some people believe that it was added later on by scribes and things along that nature. But some people tend to think that it is proper and that it should be within the text. What I will say to you is that it does not change the truth of the Bible whatsoever. Some people try to take things like this and say, see, how can you know that the Bible is accurate? How can you trust it? Well, does that information whatsoever change anything to do with what Jesus did, who He was, and how we are to get to heaven? No, obviously not. And so whether it should be part of the text or not makes no difference to me, and it doesn't change what I believe and who I'm trying to serve whatsoever. So I was just going to throw that in there. Verse 8, by examining Him yourself, you will be able to find out from Him about everything of which we accuse Him. The Jews also joined in the charge, affirming that all these things were so. So Tertullus basically tells Felix, hey, this is what has happened. We have full confidence that once you examine Paul yourself, you're going to come to the same agreement that we have come to. Verse 10, and when the governor had nodded to him to speak, Paul replied. I find it interesting that no witnesses were called forward. No evidence was provided. Felix himself did not question anything. All he did was he turned to Paul and he said, okay, now it's your turn. And so now Paul is given the opportunity to defend himself. So Paul replied, knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. So Paul does not go along the same lines that Tertullus did. He did not try to butter him up, right? He just said, hey, I know you've had a lot of experience with judging this nation of Israel, and so now I cheerfully make my defense. Notice what Paul says. He buttered him up a little. Well, I think what we need to hang on to is Paul's attitude, right? I cheerfully make my defense. I have a question for you. Think about where Paul has been in his life. Think about what he has gone through, and think about where he is right now. Basically, he's been wrongfully accused. He's been held in chains for the last several days at least. He knows he's not done anything wrong, and yet he's able to say, I cheerfully make my defense. How was Paul able to be cheerful about his situation? So, again, we've seen this with Paul several times. We know that what was Paul's focus? All that he was concerned about was serving the Lord. No matter what that required of him, he knew that that's what he needed to do. And so, again, we see him able to have this amazing attitude despite his situation. He was able to be cheerful. We see a similar idea presented in the whole book of Philippians. We know that that book was written from prison. And what was one of the key words that you read throughout the book of Philippians? Joy, right? How was he able to be joyful in prison? Well, it's because he served God. He was a servant of Christ. I do think there is a hint of some cheer or some encouragement that was provided by the Lord Himself that Paul knew about. Turn to Luke chapter 21. Now, I am well aware that Paul would have not been in this context in the original audience. But of course, this verse would apply by extension to Paul, who was an apostle. Notice what the Lord said to those men. Verse 12 of chapter 21, but before all of this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. What did Paul know? He has an opportunity. He's being brought before the governor in chains, just like the Lord said. And what is that? According to the Lord, it's an opportunity, isn't it? I wonder if that's why Paul was able to be cheerful about his defense. Because now he has another opportunity to teach the gospel. You see, again, that just goes back to the mind and heart of Paul, right? I can tell you without any hesitation that I would not be cheerful in this situation. I would not view it as an opportunity, but Paul did. And so Paul had this opportunity, and because of that, I believe he was able to be cheerful about the position that he was in. All right, verse 11. You can verify that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. So Paul points out a couple things. Number one of his purposes in going to Jerusalem was to worship. Not to stir up trouble, but was to worship. Furthermore, how many days had it been since he was in Jerusalem? 12 days. Is that any amount of time to be able to conjure up this rebellion of which they're trying to place on him? Really, they're saying he's an insurrectionist. He is equivalent to Barabbas, right? Who was trying to overrule the Roman government. That's how they're describing Paul. Could he have done that in 12 days? Actually, less than that. He had already been in prison for at least 5 or 6 days. So for 6 days, could he stir up this riot that they're trying to put on him? Well, no. Logic says that he could not. And so that's really what he is appealing to. Verse 12, and they did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. There is no evidence for what they have been saying about Paul. That's what he's saying. They didn't find me doing any of this. They didn't find me stirring up any people in the temple, in the synagogues, or in the city. Nowhere did they find me doing this. Verse 13, neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. This word for prove is an interesting word. It means to place beside. And so basically what Paul is saying, they have no evidence to lay down beside my actions to support what they're saying. It's really related to the same word that we've seen several times throughout the book of Acts. Reasoned. What did Paul do in the synagogues with the Scripture? He reasoned. What was he doing? He was proving that Jesus was the Messiah. He was taking the evidence from the Old Testament and he was laying it down beside the facts, the known facts about the life of Jesus, and proving that Jesus was the Messiah. And so that's the word that Paul is using. They are not able to lay down any evidence beside the facts of his life to show that he has done what they said that he has done. Verse 14, but this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. Well, there's a lot to unpack there in those couple of verses. We're not going to have the time to really go through all of that. But a couple of things I do want to note. Number one, Paul says, this I will confess. What does that word confess mean? We've seen it a couple of times. What does it mean? It means to say the same thing. And so what is Paul saying? He's saying that I'm going to say the same thing that the evidence of my life says. I am a part of the way. Now, what was the way? It's the church. It is the only way to God, through the church. And so Paul is saying the evidence of my life says this, that I am a part of the way. And furthermore, that I worship the God of our fathers. That is an interesting term to think about. It is one that is used quite commonly throughout the Bible. And when you read the term, the God of our fathers, it's really meant to tie together, to link God's past actions with the current situation. In other words, what Paul is saying, the same God who Abraham served, the same God that Isaac served, the same God that Jacob served, the same God that appeared to Moses in the burning bush, the same God that delivered Israel out of bondage in Egypt, the same God that delivered the law at Sinai, is the same God that I still serve to this day. That's really what he's trying to tell these people, is, hey, I am still serving the God that you think you are serving. That's who I am trying to serve. Furthermore, note that he says that I believe everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. What's the law and the prophets? It's the whole of the Old Testament, basically. And so Paul is really making a good argument for the value of the Old Testament. I think, unfortunately, we in the church have done a disservice to the Old Testament. Paul really makes a connection here between the Old Testament and a hope that he has in the resurrection. It's interesting, when you read throughout the Old Testament, there is very, very little information that's given about a resurrection. I don't know if you've ever realized that or appreciated that. But Paul says that it's there and that it provided a hope. We see a little bit of evidence of that in the life of Abraham, don't we? You remember what God told Abraham to do. He had promised this son, right? And finally, Isaac is born. And then what does God do? He tests him, right? And he says, interestingly enough, take your only son, whom you love, and offer him. Now, what does Abraham do? He goes along with it, right? He says, okay, if that's what you want me to do, that's what I'm going to do. And as a dad, I sit there and I wonder, how does Abraham have the ability to do that? Well, the writer of Hebrews helps us understand a little bit of Abraham's mindset, doesn't he? He says that he had already considered that this was the promised son, that even if he went through it, God was able to raise him from the dead. We have no evidence in the book of Genesis whatsoever that God had taught Abraham about a resurrection. But obviously, somehow, he must have. Abraham knew that there would be a resurrection from the dead, that God was able to do it. And so there is that hope of a resurrection in the Old Testament, even though it's not really explicitly brought out very much. Now, in the New Testament, it's taught about a lot. There is a whole chapter devoted to it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, isn't there? One writer put it this way, that that is one of the greatest themes that is talked about in the New Testament outside of Jesus being the Son of God, is our having a resurrection one day. Now notice how Paul describes it. He says that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. There's a lot there that really contradicts some of the beliefs that are out there in the world. But needless to say, we just need to hang on to this. There will be one resurrection, and it will be both just and unjust. And from there, what will happen? We will all be judged, right? And so those that have done right will be ushered into the arms of the Lord in eternity, and those that have not will be what? Delivered into punishment. And so Paul describes that as having a hope in that resurrection. I find that very interesting. What is a biblical hope? It's not the same hope that we have on earth, is it? It's a surety, isn't it? It's I know, I expect it. And that's what Paul is saying, that I know that this is going to happen. I know that one day God is going to send His Son back, and those that have already died are going to be raised from the dead, and we're going to meet Him in the air. And so that is a very, very powerful thing to think about. And it's a reminder of what we are really striving for here on earth, isn't it? That is not the ultimate goal, that is the only goal. That's our goal, is at the resurrection to be part of the just. And so that should be a strong reminder for you and I. Verse 16, so I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man, in light of there being one day God judging us, of there being a resurrection from the dead. What does Paul say? I always take pains. That's an interesting thought there. The idea is that he disciplines himself, or he exercises himself, he molds himself, all those ideas. He takes pains to have a clear conscience before God and man. I personally sometimes get too lax about the way that I can be perceived to mankind. You see, a lot of times, me personally, this is just me, I have the mindset, well, as long as I'm right between God, that's all that really matters. accusers? Well, the Apostle Paul would argue with me. Paul said what? That I exercise myself in order to have a clear conscience before God and who else? And man. See, as Christians, we do have a responsibility to our fellow men, don't we? The Apostle Paul thought so. And so I think we need to be aware of that. Verse 17, now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. This is a reference to basically his third missionary journey. One of the main things that he did on that journey was what? To make a collection for those that were in need in Jerusalem. And so when he got to Jerusalem, another purpose of him being there was to be able to provide that help that was needed by those in that area. Verse 18, while I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and to make an accusation should they have anything against me. What Paul is referencing here is basically an old Roman legal principle that the person that was being accused had the right to stand in front of their accusers and make a defense. Well, the original accusers were what? These Jews from Asia. They were the ones that found him in the temple and claimed that he had done what? That he had defiled the temple by bringing Gentiles into the temple, right? Does everybody remember that? That's what Paul is referencing back here to. Guess who was not in this setting? His accusers. And so they're not even there to present their evidence for what Paul had done. And so Paul is saying, hey, I don't even have a right to defend myself against my accusers. Verse 20, or else let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they have found when I stood before the council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you this day. Paul admits there's about only one thing that you could say that you could link me to that had caused any disturbance. And that was when I talked about the resurrection of the dead in front of the Sanhedrin. And what did that result in? It resulted in a big argument and a big fight, basically. And so Paul says that's pretty much the only thing that you could link me to as to being able to say that I caused any type of disturbance, which ironically is a religious issue. It's not a civil issue. And so really Paul is basically saying, really, Felix, you don't have anything to do with this. The only thing that I could have been linked to is a religious issue. It's really between me and the Jews. It shouldn't have anything to do with you. But that's the situation that Paul was in. Verse 22, but Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, I find that interesting. How did this Roman governor have an accurate knowledge of the church? We don't know. We know that one of the 7 men, Philip, ended up in Caesarea. Stephen was murdered. Philip ended up in Caesarea, and so we speculate that he had stayed there and continued to teach the gospel. Maybe Felix heard it from him. Maybe he heard it from some people that were converted by Philip. I don't know. But we do know that somehow Felix had an accurate knowledge of the way. And so because of that, he put them off. In other words, he told these Jews, listen, I'm not going to worry about it now. Y'all go away. I'm done with this for now. So he put them off, saying, when Lysias, the tribune, comes down, I will decide your case. Really, Felix is kind of showing a character default here. He knew that Paul was innocent. He had an accurate knowledge of the church. And so what should have been his reaction to this? He should have let Paul go, right? That was the right thing to do. But in a character defect and weakness, what did he do? Well, he was really more concerned about staying happy with the Jews, and so he was going to wait till Lysias comes down, which there's no evidence that he ever did, before deciding the case against Paul. Verse 23, then he gave orders to the centurion that he should be kept in custody, but have some liberty, and that none of his friends should be prevented from attending to his needs. So basically, Paul was going to be on house arrest. He would have been chained to a Roman soldier pretty much everywhere he went, but his basic needs would have been met. He would have been given water, food, everything that he needed, and also he would have been allowed for his friends to come and visit him and help take care of him. And don't you just know that some of the Christians in that area made it a point to go and be with Paul every chance that they could. At least that's what I hope happened. That's what I would like to think happened. Verse 24, after some days, Felix came down with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, and he sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. So, we don't know how many days it was. It says after some days, but after some time, Felix gets back in touch with Paul. And this time he has his wife Drusilla with him. And she is described as a Jew. I believe she was at least half Jewish. But she also was a descendant of the Herods. Her father was Herod Antipas, I believe, or Herod Agrippa, one of the two. It was the Herod that killed James the Apostle in Acts chapter 12. That was her dad, I believe. And so her great uncle would have been the one that beheaded John the Baptist, and that would make her great grandfather the Herod that tried to kill the infant Jesus by having the babies killed in Bethlehem. And so that's the family that she came out of. It's important to know some things about this couple. First off, they are living in an adulterous marriage right now, at the time that we're talking about. She was previously married, and of course Felix lured her away from that marriage, and she ended up being married to Felix. It is said, historical documents tell us, that she was very, very beautiful. And so maybe that's what led Felix to try to persuade her to marry him. I don't know. But this is a couple that was basically living a lustful life, full of greed, full of want, and pretty much anything that they wanted, they got. And so keep that in the back of your mind as we think about some of what Paul is going to talk to them about. And so they call Paul forward, and he is going to speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Now notice Luke provides us with a little bit of detail about that sermon that he gives them. Verse 25, and as he, here's that word, reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix was alarmed and said, "Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you." So Luke gives us the detail that Paul really latches on to three things in his sermon. Number one, righteousness. Now, we're not given the exact details about the righteousness that he talks about. He could be talking about the righteousness of God, and that would be along the lines of God fulfilling all that he said he was going to do, that he continues to act in accordance with his will no matter what. But it also could extend to the righteousness that we are to exhibit, right? And us submitting to God's will. Now, if that was the case, boy, that would have been a foreign concept to this couple. They had no concept whatsoever of having to submit to another authority. But that was the type of person that Paul was, right? He was going to tell whoever he was in front of what they needed to hear. And so he talked to them about righteousness. Furthermore, he talked about self-control. Boy, this is something that this couple did not have whatsoever. They had no idea, no concept of needing to have self-control whatsoever. It's almost similar to people in the world today, isn't it? In the world that we live in. There's really a lot of people have no concept of self-control. But really, the idea is to exercise a rule over oneself. But in the New Testament, there's a little more involved with that. There's the idea of us allowing God's will to exercise rule over us. In other words, our self-control comes by letting God, basically His will, have an effect on us. His desires become our desires, is what I'm trying to say. And so that's some of what is being thought of here in this context. And then, of course, the judgment to come. Again, this couple had no reason whatsoever to fear a judgment. At no point, really, had they needed to answer to anybody about their lifestyle here on earth. But Paul knew they needed to know one day there's going to come a day where you have to give an answer for what you have done. And of course, that is also true of you and I. And so once Paul said these things, we notice that Felix was alarmed. The word there is frightened, acute mental agitation. And so we see that the words of Paul had an effect on the governor, didn't it? Now, Luke does not provide us any information about the effect of his wife, Drusilla. And so we assume that there was no effect whatsoever. It may have hardened her heart a little more. I don't know. But Felix was alarmed. And notice what he says. Go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. And so Felix is not the first person to be frightened by the words of the truth. There have been times in my life where that was the proper response. That I knew I was not doing things in accordance with God's Word, and it frightened me. And I knew I needed to make a change. Some of you have probably been in the same situation. But what we need to know is that fear alone, without it resulting in submission and a change in lifestyle, is really useless. It's valueless. And we see an example of this in Felix. He was fearful, but what did he do? He didn't change. What did he tell Paul? Go away for now, and at a more convenient time, I'm going to call you back. Right, it didn't take but 2 years, right? That's how long Paul stayed in the chains under the command of Felix. But what we need to understand is the most convenient time is now. Always. We're never promised another moment. Felix was not promised another moment. We have no evidence whatsoever that Felix ever heard the gospel again. Now, he did have more discussions with Paul, so I would like to think that Paul continued to try to maybe mention things to him every time that they had discussions, but there is no evidence whatsoever that Felix was scared or fearful or that the words of Paul had an effect on him again. That was his opportunity. That was the most convenient time. And unfortunately, now thus Felix is an example of many, many people who are lost by procrastination. There's never a better time than now. Never. And so we all need to be cognizant and aware of that. Verse 26, at the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul, so he sent for him often and conversed with him. So again, we see a little evidence that there continued to be somewhat of a relationship between him and Paul, but we see Felix's motivation. He wanted Paul to bribe him, basically. That's what he was saying. When 2 years had elapsed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, and desiring to do the Jews a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. Chapter 25, now 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea, and the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem, because they were planning an ambush to kill him on the way. Isn't it amazing that these men still had this hateful attitude towards Paul after 2 years? After 2 years, they still had the same plan to try to ambush and kill this man. I wonder if the original 40 who made the vow had started eating and drinking again. What do you think? I imagine they did, don't you? And so they still had this evil plot to try to ambush and kill him. Verse 4, Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. So, said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. After he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea, and the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. Basically, Festus is convening court. That's what it means when it says he sat on his tribunal. He sat on his judgment seat. And so he is going to be convening court, and Paul is going to be ordered to be brought in. Verse 7, when he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Well, what else is new? They hadn't been able to prove anything, but yet they're still hurling these charges against the apostle. Verse 8, Paul argued in his defense, "Neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed against any offense." This goes back to what Paul made a comment about. He says, I take pains to have a clear conscience before who? Before God and man. And that's what he just said. I have not done anything wrong according to the Jewish law. I have not done anything wrong against the temple, and I have not done anything against Caesar. Basically, I have not done anything against the Roman system, okay? But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, have you noticed a theme with these governors? They were more concerned about pleasing men than doing what was right. That's never good in life, is it? When you're more concerned about pleasing mankind than doing what is right, things never are good. Never. He says, but Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, "Do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? Please find me another time in the history of the world that a person on the judgment seat asked the person on trial, 'What do you want to do? Do you want to stay here or do you want to go to Jerusalem?'" I mean, this man really, he really didn't know what he was getting into, it seems. Verse 10, but Paul said, "I am standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried." In other words, I know I'm not going to get a fair treatment in Jerusalem before the Jews. I clearly know that you're not going to stand up and let me go free. So what do I need to do? I need to be tried by Caesar. And so that's what's going to happen. "To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourselves know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death." Little side note here, Paul was not against capital punishment. What did he just say? He said, if I've done anything that's worthy of death, guess what? I need to submit to the punishment. But of course he had not. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. As a Roman citizen, that's the right that he had. No one could take that away from him. And so as a citizen of Rome, he could always appeal to the higher court. And so the next higher court would have been Caesar in his particular situation. Verse 12, then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go." Now you remember, what was one of Paul's things? At this time, he's already written the book of Romans. And what was one of the things that he talked about throughout that book? He had such a strong desire to go and be with him, didn't he? And then you think back to Acts chapter 23, verse 11. What did the Lord tell Paul? "You have witnessed about me in Jerusalem. Don't worry, I need you to go and do it." Where? In Rome. And so Paul knew, hey, I have to get to Rome. Now, I doubt very seriously that is how Paul really thought that he was going to end up getting to Rome, but God works in mysterious ways, doesn't he? And so that's how Paul was going to get to Rome. Okay, we're going to pick up in verse 13 next week.